So good evening and welcome. I'm James Hackney, Dean of Northeastern University School of Law. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Most of all, our appreciation goes to Fran, Jesse, and Jonah for allowing our community the privilege of honoring Dan. We consider your family to be part of our family, and it means so much that we can get together here at Northeastern to celebrate the life and legacy of Dean Dan, as he was so affectionately known. So 3 quick stories of lessons that I learned from Dan about being Dean. The first lesson was when he called me to say that they were making me an offer to be an assistant professor at the law school. And I immediately knew I was in a negotiation. So negotiating, lesson 1. Lesson 2, faculty meeting management. I recall quite vividly at a heated faculty meeting when Dan had what I think lawyers would call an excited utterance, and he yelled out, "Horse shit!" Now, if that was aimed at anyone in the audience, well, anyway, sorry. That's just the way it happened. And then another very memorable time was when we actually played 18 holes of golf, and you know, the kind of ups and downs of golfing, and it was, you know, a lot of life lessons. And I wasn't a very good golfer. Dan was actually a very skilled golfer, and he said, "Okay, great round, James." And he recommended that I begin playing with Steve Soup. A great friend, but not quite as skilled a golfer as Dan, and it was more along my lines, but all very good. So, you know, as I look out on all of you tonight, I see Dan's family, friends, former colleagues, and former students. I see people who worked alongside Dan for years. To me, Dan seemed ageless and timeless. He defied the constraints of time, and often with his hand gestures, the constraints of gravity. And in doing so, he inspired all of us to make an impact on the world. That's what mattered most to Dan, that this law school, through the combined efforts of our faculty and staff, would teach generation after generation of lawyers how to uphold and fight for the rule of law, to advocate for the voiceless and the oppressed, to create a more just and fair world for everyone. Dan's curiosity was insatiable, his commitment unwavering. He was guided by core values and principles about how we treat one another. His brilliance was matched only by his kindness. He lived a life of purpose and impact. By the size of the crowd here tonight, I know that we all mourn the loss of such a deeply cherished family member, mentor, friend, and colleague. It's now my pleasure to invite Professor Emerita Judith Olin Brown forward to offer a few words. Judy.
My name is Judy Brown. I'm glad James told some funny stories because I have some too. I know that Dan would love to be remembered with laughter as well as with tears. I went to law school because I didn't want to become a teacher. I'm old. So teaching was the primary, in fact, the only career opportunity open for women when I graduated from college. So of course I wanted to do anything but become a teacher. One day my phone rang at the law firm where I was making enough money to pay off my school debts, but bored to tears, inviting me to offer a course at Northeastern's newly reopened law school. and I stayed there for 30 years. So the rest is history. I really love Northeastern's idea of creating a new and better way to teach law students. But when I arrived, I was really taken aback because the facilities were disgusting. We had to outshout the traffic noise on Huntington Avenue. We didn't have mics that worked. The rooms were either blazingly hot or freezing cold. And then I met Dan. Dan Givelber built this law school. He was a superb advocate. He convinced the central administration that the law school was the jewel in the president's crown. And the president gave us everything Danny asked for. So we got a new building. I gotta tell you another story about, this is my favorite story, about Dan's brilliance as an advocate. It was a dark and stormy night. All good stories start like that. And Steve, Dan, and I had gone to an alumni event. It was freezing cold and pouring rain, and we had parked in the wrong place. So we were making our way through the blizzard back to our cars when we saw a sign for Lockovers, which, for those of you who grew up here, was a very snobby, very old-fashioned, very fancy restaurant in Boston, which had a very strict dress code. So Dan, who was a big foodie with Fran, said, "Let's go." And I said, "We can't get in there, we look like drowned rats." Dan said, "Watch this." So Steve and Dan were not wearing ties, and Dan was wearing sneakers, his beloved black Nikes. The tuxedoed host did not want to let him in. Dan drew himself up to his full height. "These are not sneakers. These are the shoes I wore in the United States Navy when I was serving my country." I thought the guy was going to offer Danny a medal. We had such a good dinner, and when we left, the guy gave us his umbrella. Dan was a pioneer. He was decisive. While other faculties were applying for grants to help them study how to think about clinical education, Dan just did it. When other faculties were torn apart by deciding what to do about the lack of women students and students of color and LGBTQ students, Dan just went ahead and recruited and admitted them. I got several calls from a distinguished male friend at a distinguished law school across the river who said, "You guys are so good at this. Can you introduce me to this guy Givelber so he can tell me how to do it?" One day Dan happened to answer the telephone in the admissions office. It was a young woman who said that while her husband was happy at Northeastern, she was miserable at Harvard. Could she come? Dan said, "Of course." Today, Rashmi Dialshun is Associate Dean and a full professor at Northeastern Law School. Dan was fun, and he was funny. His humor was legendary. As I said before, Fran and Dan were great foodies. They were always the first to try out the new restaurants. This was before you could make reservations online. And Dan was very frustrated because no one could spell Givelber and no one could pronounce it. So he would always say he was Jim Brown. And Dan was so wise. He understood that most legal education had totally failed to integrate theory and practice. He built an institution dedicated to doing that. Today, just about every law school in the country has finally acknowledged that Dan was right. That's the way to train lawyers. Dan led by example. He believed in using the law as an instrument of social change. The Innocence Project, the CERT Clinic, Billy Moore. And those are just a few examples of his commitment to justice. which continue to inspire generations of law students. He was a brilliant classroom teacher. He had an ability to be rigorous and challenging at the same time. After he died, I heard from so many alums who said they couldn't have made it through law school without Dan. And he was my mentor too. When I arrived, I felt lost. I had no clue what a law professor was supposed to do. So I asked Dan, and his response guided me for the next 30 years. The purpose of this law school, he said, is to teach the kids how to be superb lawyers. The fact that so many of you kids, and you'll always be our kids to me, Steve and Dan, proves again how right Danny was. He was a wonderful friend. Working with him, learning from him, teaching with him, writing with him, laughing with him, and sometimes crying with him were some of the great joys of my life. I really miss him. I was very lucky. I had two mentors. You'll now hear from my other mentor, Steve Subrin.
Do I need this, or can you hear me? You can hear me okay?
No, you
You can't hear me. Okay, so I need this. This isn't the order I had in mind for joining me, and I'm still pissed off at him for going first. Like Judy, I miss him terribly. Dan's life was full of laughter. When you went through our hallways, and you didn't have to know which class was Dan, all you'd have to do is listen. And then, I don't know how he did it. I really, to this day, do not understand why you had to laugh with Dan. He would scratch his head. He would talk. You could barely understand. And everyone would laugh. I don't think we've ever had a teacher who so much inspired the students not to be lawyers, but to actually enjoy themselves. And I think that the law school to this day has such an open feeling and is so full of joy. It has law students who actually enjoy law school is because of Dan. In many ways, Dan was the best person at what he tried. In the building, there was no doubt that he was the best writer. I would get back from Judy crossed out words and red lines and everything. When Dan gave her things, she would say fine. He was fabulous with numbers. There was something in Dan that had a count. He had to look at life in terms of how many there were, and how many people, and how many were in crime, and how many to do. It was very important to him to be able to quantify what was going on. He was a very brave guy. I remember when Rabbi Millman was going to Russia, and asked if Dan wanted to go, and Dan said, sure. Dan brought all his medicine illegally to Russia. It never occurred to him that he could get caught. He just did it. He did the same thing in civil rights. He just, without any regard to his own safety, he just did it. This is the way it was. He always said yes. I would imagine there's no one in the room who ever heard Dad say no. He only did no once. When he was on an airplane, he asked the person in charge if he had to jump. The guy said no. And Dad said, okay. I won't jump. There was no question in his mind what the most important constituency was at the law school. It all had to do with the students. It was not the other professors, it was not the administrators. For Dan, the one constituency that counted at the law school were students. It was the kids. They were his kids. He had to take care of them. He had to make them into good lawyers, and that was it. The legacy that Don has left at the law school is public interest, extreme openness, and students. You could walk through the law school today, and it's Dan's law school. Public interest, the kids. It was always the kids. And who comes next? Billy? Who comes next?
Billy.
Billy. Billy's part of Dan's legacy, actually.
You better know it. Thank you very much. I don't know what that was, you know, but it looks important. It is a great honor to be here. And one thing I would like to say is today is November the 8th, and I'm not sure if you understand the significance of this day. Because this is the day on November the 8th, 1991, that I got out of prison. None of that would have happened had it not been for Dan. When I was on death row, struggling without an attorney, a young lady named Diana Hicks, a graduate of this college, took my case. And then she, for some reason, decided she's going to quit. She said, I will not leave you without a lawyer. I get a letter a week later from this professor named Dan Givelber. He said, I heard about your case and I'd like to take it. And I wrote him back and said, why? Why would you want to take my case? It's a guilty plea. I'm a death row inmate. I said, I know a lot of people want to take cases so they can get into federal courts and get all this glory and stuff. So why would you want to do it? I said, matter of fact, if you want to take my case, you'll come down to the prison and you'll tell me personally. Well, a week later, Dan was there. He came into the prison. He said, okay, here I am. Now, I'm going to tell you again, I'd like to take your case. I said, okay, I want to ask you some questions. Now see, I hated lawyers. I had 2 bad lawyers and I hated all of them. I thought they was all shysters. So when he came in, I didn't know what he was up to. I said, listen, if you want to take this case, I got some rules, like I'm paying him some money. He said, what rules are those? I said, anything that you file, you got to send a copy to me first, double space, and I'm going to do it. And if I don't like what you wrote, I'm going to line it out. And if you don't like my lining out, you explain to me why it's wrong. But I said, I get the Supreme Court opinions in every death penalty case every day. So the clerk sends them to me, I read them, I make issues. So I know about this death penalty stuff. So we're not going to play any games. He said, okay, I can do that. And And I'm like, are you kidding me? He's going to do this like I'm really paying him money. And he says, yes, I can do that. I said, okay, I have another question I need to ask you. He said, what's that? I said, well, if you take this case, you have to promise me that you'll stay on this case. So either I get off death row or I'm executed. I don't want no more lawyers hopping on and off. And he calmly said, I can do that. And I believed him because I could tell in his voice, I can tell that even though he just met me, I don't know how much Diane had told him about me, but he was concerned. And just like the first attorney that I had was really concerned about me, not the laws that we were dealing with, not the death penalty we were dealing with, but concerned about me as a person. So Dan is the person who rehabilitated me. So it's not Dan Givelber, it's Dan Get Better. Help me to get better. And he would talk to me, and he would ask me about my family. It wasn't just like, I'm your attorney, tell me about the case, and let's do this and that. No, he wanted to know who I was. He wanted to know what made me who I was. And then he was more than willing to offer who he was. He told me about Fran, he told me about Jesse, he told me about Jonah, he told me about all his kids, his family. No one had ever done that. So we became very close. When I had the execution date, that I came within 7 hours of being executed, I was on death watch for 3 days. Dan was there. He was going through this just as much as I was, but he was there. And he wasn't just there in body, he was there as a person. I mean, my own father had died, and it was like he was stepping into place like he was my father, because we were that close. Had it not been for Dan, working with the members of the victim's family, who I knew and began to write, and we became real close, had it not been for Dan organizing them together, they would not have went to the parole board and said, listen, Billy is our brother and you cannot kill him. Lawyers need to learn how to communicate with folks, because it was his ability to communicate with victims, family members, to get them to want to help. Now, they wanted to help me because they knew me, but they weren't going to do it on their own. They needed something like an official, and Dan was the legal attorney official to let them know it was okay for you to do what you wanted to do. Had it not been for Dan and the package that he sent to the parole board, that for the first time in history of the state of Georgia, where a person who committed a crime, pled guilty to it, was sentenced to death, that the parole board commuted that sentence from death to life. And then told me that I would have to serve 25 years before they would consider thinking about me coming up for parole. But had it not been for the package that Dan made, that was at the parole board, that they decided to review, how about 13 months later, they let me out of prison? Not 25 years later, 13 months later. This is the legacy of Northeastern Law School. This is what Dan is teaching his students to do, to be great lawyers, to be able to communicate with their clients and help their clients and let them know it is not all about the law. It's about you in the law, but we can get over this together no matter how bad it looks. Because just think about it. How worse can you get? A death penalty case, a guilty plea. How worse can you get? That's about the worst case that you can get. I was searching for lawyers for days. You know what they would tell me? You pled guilty and we nothing we can do about this case. And I pled guilty because I was guilty. And Dan understood that. He didn't come in and say, why did you do that? He understood how the murder affected me. He understood how I was hurt by it. And he understood how to help me to get over that. And to help me to be able to help other people. And as soon as I got out of prison, I think the very next year, Dan had me come to Northeastern University to speak to his law students. And not only that, to show you the graciousness of Dan, he had me to come over his house and stay with Fran and his son. Who would do that? Think about that. You were talking about a convicted murderer. Would you bring him into your house? Dan did. Because he trusted me. Dan did because he was a wonderful guy. He did not because he was just a professor here. He did because he's a great human being. And everywhere I go, I talk about Dan. I have been to South Africa. I have been to England. I've been to Spain. I've been to Germany. Everywhere I go, they know about this attorney. Every law school I go to in the United States, and I've been to almost every one of them, they know about Dan Givelber. So if they don't hear about him here, they know about him when I get through with him. And they'll understand that if you want to be a lawyer, you need to follow in the steps of Dan Givelber. Thank you very much. Mr. Peter Schruck. Simon Bowen, professor of Yale Law School.
That was a long time ago. Talk about acts being tough to follow. I really should just sit down, and I think I will in just a few minutes. But I thought it would be illuminating about Dan to at least one aspect of the multifaceted Dan, to tell briefly about how I met him. I met him in early September 1965 when I was in my first day of practice at a large, anonymous, boring, utterly unattractive law firm. And I already concluded that on my first day there. That firm shall go nameless, since I've just slandered it. While I was awaiting a call from a partner who would give me undoubtedly a fascinating research assignment, I decided to take a walk around the firm. And so I began to walk down the hall next to my office, and I passed an open door, and I was astonished to see a ceiling which was studded with acoustical tiles and pencils dangling from the holes in the acoustic tiles. And I couldn't imagine how this happened except for somebody flipping them. And sure enough, there in that office was Dan Givelber, who turns out, among his many other great attributes, to be a quite skillful pencil flipper. I dare say, I don't know all of you here, but I challenge you to emulate him. So I was intrigued by this. I knocked on the door and I said, "Can I come in?" And I introduced myself. I said, "It's my first day on the job. You know, what's this place like?" And he said, "Well, you saw what I'm doing." So we became very fast friends. This was in the day when Dan had a full head of hair. He was an occasional pipe smoker. He was a Marlboro man. He was a parachute packer for the Navy. And he was also the consummate do-gooder. Now, Billy Moore's story is is nationally famous, world famous, and is an extraordinary saga of achievement and of vindication. Dan and Fran were very much of the spirit to do as much good as they could for other people during their time here. And they went down to Mississippi. Dan took time off from the firm to do that, and Franny, I think, did some teaching there or some child-related work. And they were exhilarated by the experience, and they never ceased to contribute to the civil rights cause. Now, after the pencil flipping experience, Dan and Fran and Marcy and I began to socialize with the Givelbers regularly. They were very quirky and funny people. And they amused us with stories about their earlier lives, including their fateful meeting at Gruber's in Cleveland, a restaurant, when their great adventure together began. From that day forward, there was no other man in Franny's life than Dan, and no other woman in Dan's life than Fran. Laughter was obviously a key ingredient of their incredibly close relationship, along with smarts. Dan was a first-rate mind, as Steve Subrin and the Dean have recounted, with a formidable memory for the mountain of books that he read and the mind for information. Also, his travels around the world and around the country augmented that brilliance. Dan was always drawn to public service, and he, as soon as he could, he left the law firm and moved to Washington and became an assistant U.S. attorney, where he acquired the hands-on lawyering in criminal law, procedure, and law reform skills that he later brought to bear on the curriculum at Northeastern and his own research and writing. The rest, of course, is history, which others can better recount than I. His total commitment to the school and its model of cooperative education, his public service on health policy and other boards, his original scholarship in the environment, criminal justice, and other fields, his development of an innovative program to reform capital punishment, including, of course, his long and successful exoneration of Billy Moore, and his successful terms as dean, where he nurtured the community of faculty and students whom he loved and who loved him in return. Before sitting down, just let me mention a couple of aspects of Dan's life that may be less widely known. First, of course, was the tightly knit Givelber family. Not just Franny, whom he adored, but Jesse and Jonah, of whom he was immensely proud. Plus his nurturance of the extended Givelber clan, many of whom are here tonight. It was an old-fashioned family life, emphasizing deep morality and mutual generosity, mostly by example rather than by preaching. Second, Dan bore his burdens privately and with consummate dignity. Only a small group of friends knew about the long-running trauma that Dan and his family experienced when the 14-year-old Jonah suffered a devastating, life-threatening injury. Dan and Fran helped to save his life and devoted countless hours to Jonah's rehabilitation and subsequent development into the utterly charming, singular, funny family man and therapist that Jonah is today. Those of you who haven't seen him or experienced him in recent years can do so tonight. I don't think he'll charge you. Dan doted on the multi-talented Jessie and her various careers as actress, lawyer, and celebrated cookbook author. And finally, there's the immense gift of Dan's friendship that has enriched so many of us here. The generosity, the availability, and compassion that he extended to his friends in need. Dan, we'll always miss you. We cherish our memories of our time together. Rest in well-deserved peace.
Good evening, I'm Mark Irvings. As is apparent from the list of speakers, I'm the only former student who has been asked to talk about Dan. As such, I'm a representative not just of the class of '75, which many of us here know was the seminal class of law school, but of all classes, and it's a very heavy burden. But you're wondering, why Irvings? And my area, labor and employment law, alternative dispute resolution, nothing to do with criminal law, appellate advocacy. Well, the reality is that 2 years after I graduated from law school, my wife Susan and I were fortunate enough to buy a house in Brookline back when it was cheap, around the corner from the Givelbers. Truth be told, it initially really pissed Dan off, but it was a little bigger than theirs. But fortunately, it started, he got over it, and it started a 50-year friendship with Fran and Dan, which included a lot of good meals, some great wine. But the reason I'm really here is that Susan and I were among the first people to employ Jesse and Jonah as babysitters. So this is sort of an acknowledgement for providing spending money. So kidding aside, my long relationship with Dan gave me the opportunity to experience him not just as a professor, but as a friend. And in preparing for tonight, I spoke with some classmates and other friends who went through Northeastern for their impressions, and it was uniform. I mean, summary, this is the definition of the mensch. That's who Dan was. But everybody mentioned his decency.
Mark, can you use the mic?
His decency, his humility, and of course, his sense of humor. In the early 70s, when we started law school, our preconception of what law school would be was what was later shown in the paper chase or in Scott Turo's 1L. A foreboding, humiliating experience. Our class was composed of almost exclusively people who had been out of school for a while, who had been working in the adult world, who had their own experiences, who expected to be treated as adults. Plus, we were of the Vietnam War protest generation. We were used to challenging authority. So we were wondering how this was going to be. And we saw, geez, Dan was a Harvard grad and Steve was a Harvard grad. But what was incredible was the tone that was set. That it was clear that Dan and, again, Steve and Judy treated us with respect as equals, a willingness to hear from students and get their perspectives. This was a radical thing. I have to say, he was a lot funnier than the two of you. It was really But, so it was an incredible, pleasant surprise to encounter Dan. He was, as everybody said, an incredible legal mind. He took the law very seriously, but he did not take himself seriously, which was an unusual, perhaps a misleading view of what it was going to be like to practice law, and certainly if anybody went into a law firm. But rather than, it was clear he enjoyed teaching adults and did not treat us as semi-ignorant neophytes who needed to be humiliated in front of their peers. So that's why I always felt that if you had to go to law school, the only place to go to law school was Northeastern, because it was human. And his stories that he wove in gave you an insight into the reality. These stories about when he was on trial, that every night he would go home and assume the fetal position. Or the tip that when you were in court and the judge came in and everybody had to stand, you should remember to move your chair back before you stood so you didn't knock over the water pitcher on the counsel table. These were really valuable tips. And it gave us the confidence, but it also let you know it was okay to feel a little imposter syndrome, that this was normal, you could still be a very effective adult. And of course, his sense of humor. He was not a joke teller, per se, but he had a dry and quick wit. My sons always reminded me, they said, "Dad, you're not actually funny. They're laughing because you're the arbitrator." You know, Dan, in contrast, was genuinely funny, and his witty remarks were always appropriate. They served to relax students and focus attention rather than divert. He was often self-deprecating, but he never made a joke at anybody else's expense. He was a person who conveyed respect, and you felt better about yourself, and you certainly felt great about him. His classes were enjoyable. I admit we were in school before Al Gore invented the internet, so I don't know for sure if we had the capacity to be amused by something other than sitting in class, whether he would have, but my sense is that even after the internet, students enjoyed his class. So as a friend, he exhibited all these same characteristics. I will say, so as not to make it sound saintly, when he drove us to dinner, he was not Mr. Mello. So with that, Harry Givelber, his brother.
Thank you. I don't know if you knew that Dan had a brother, but he did, and it's me. Hi. I have known Danny longer than anyone else. I was there when he was born on February 9th, 1940. He's 22 months younger than I am. According to my mom, I called him Honey when he came home from the hospital. And I did that until he went to kindergarten. And at that point, I changed it to Danny. To me, he is still Danny, even though everybody else calls him Dan. When we shared a room together, I learned about snoring. Dan had lots of benefits of being the younger child. When I asked my parents if a friend of mine and I could drive to New York City, they said no, and we had to take a bus. He, a year later, went out west with two friends that he hardly knew. And I don't know how he persuaded my parents to do that. And another example, I played the clarinet very badly for 5 years, and he played the baritone for 1 year. Being born in February, he was supposed to graduate in January, 2 years for me, but instead he took extra classes so he could graduate with me, or I mean a year with me, and that's what he did. We both went to Harvard. And in his first year there, he took at least one science course. He then told our parents that he would not be a doctor, no matter what they hoped. I don't remember if he said he would be a lawyer, but at some point he decided to go to law school. You all know how that turned out. When we were kids in the late 40s and early 50s in Cleveland, you could sit in the bleachers for a few dollars and watch the Cleveland Browns. I have remained loyal to that team, but Danny switched to Boston teams. In terms of sports, neither of us were very athletic. My mother, in fact, claimed that she was the best athlete in the family. But we did play golf, and Danny was better than me. Danny led a good life. He had no problems as an adolescent. He did not get into any trouble. He had, I was there when he was born, and also there at Gruber's restaurant when he met Franny. She was starting college at Wellesley, and he was a sophomore at Harvard. As far as I know, they had a wonderful life together. When he first came home after being born, I called him honey. And 83 years later, he was still a great guy. Thank you.
Hello. My dad was the greatest. Loving, funny, supportive. All the adjectives one might imagine when describing the ideal dad. He also, and this is underappreciated, single-handedly turned me into the fanatical, often quasi-disturbing Boston sports fan that I am. He would have denied this, but only because he was a little horrified of what he'd created. Throughout my childhood, he would ruefully shake his head and talk about the Cleveland Browns, all the while taking me to Celtics, Red Sox, and occasional Patriots games, thus cultivating my deep obsession with Boston sports. When the Pats enjoyed their era of dominance, he would sigh as I decked my sons out in Pats gear and religiously watched every game, dissected every play, debated every trade with them. And then he would join in. The reason I share this anecdote with you is that it describes my experience of my dad. He just wanted to hang out with me. I spoke sports, so he immersed himself so we could do it together. Being in a city with so many championship teams didn't hurt either. Though not at a championship level, I spent most of my middle school and high school years playing basketball in my driveway, often with my dad. My boys and nephews shot hoops with him back there too. Even towards the end of his life, if there was a grandson shooting hoops, my dad would be out there in the fray. All of this highlights the kind of guy my dad was, a dedicated father, grandfather, husband, and friend. His professional role as a Northeastern Law professor and dean was something that made me immensely proud, and certainly that informed our interactions at home. His long-suffering editing of my school papers, thanks Dad, his dedication to justice, his tremendous intellect. I always knew my whole life that even if he was despairing at something I had written or done, he was always in my corner, my biggest fan. When my wife and I moved across the country, every 6 weeks ago or so, we could count on a visit. He was always there, ready to help out, pick up a grandchild, and babysit. My father led by example. Find meaningful work and do it well. Take care of and love your family and friends. Enjoy the world around you and always learn. Care about justice and do something to help others. Growing up with him, I learned to be the husband, father, and man that I am today. This is not to say he was perfect. He was famously impatient, a terrifying driver, and the loudest sneezer you ever heard. But he was my dad, I loved him, and he would have been slightly embarrassed and enormously pleased at this beautiful tribute in his honor. Love you, Dad.
I don't know what this is, but I'm gonna put it right there.
Hello. So I was almost 12 years old when Bo Derek's infamous movie 10 hit theaters. And my young friends and I gathered soon after its release to rate the boys at school and determine which, if any, were 10s. John Mahoney was mentioned, as was Harry Gold and Jonathan Charney. But when my turn came to make the call, none of the boys in my grade, or the grades above, or the grades below, came to my mind. Instead, I announced, well, I really think my dad is a 10. And I was not the only young person to think so. When my mom, at 17, a mere 5 years older than I was when Bo introduced me to the concept, met my dad, she realized pretty quickly she had a 10 on her hands. I mean, yes, she might have wavered a bit as to his ranking her junior year when she was abroad in France and he was still at Harvard, and she might have even written him a letter or two spelling out her ambivalence. But in the face of such wavering, my dad did what any 10 worth his weight in gold would do. He responded with a love letter of sorts, typed, single-spaced, 8 pages, in which he argued his worthiness, supporting said argument with his philosophy about life, happiness, and relationships. I discovered this letter when my sister-in-law and I were going through my dad's office in the days after his death. And I thought I would share some of it now, as even at 20 years old, his insight into love and marriage and second thoughts couldn't be more astute and romantic. So, Dan Givelber, my dad, on honesty. You wonder why we have grown apart this year, Franny. It's not that you are thinking different thoughts or having different experiences, which I cannot and do not share. It is because we were both afraid to be honest. My dad on the importance of compromise in marriage or in a relationship. This year, I have come to realize that I was being foolish in not doing a lot of things that Boston offered me. I mean, I did go to 3 operas, and I never would have gone to any if it hadn't been for you dragging me to one last year. But there is a lot of stuff that I didn't do. Do you know why? Because I wanted to do them with you. My dad on love. Whatever each of us is like, really like, our love is based on that. It isn't based on you go to Wellesley and I go to Harvard and so we ought to be together. I think we really know one another. And any relationship that is based on that kind of knowledge and includes affection for each other is healthy, maybe wholesome, I don't know. And then in parentheses he writes, as I write this, I am possessed with a great fear that at any moment I'll start quoting the words of a popular song. Always funny, always loving, always smart, always persuasive, and obviously always a 10. We miss you and love you, Dad.
Wow, that was all very spectacular. Thanks to everyone for those wonderful words. I'm going to close tonight with a special announcement, which I think is a true testament to how much Dan means to our community. Shortly after Dan's passing, Bill Newman, class of 1975, came to us with a brilliant idea for a beautiful tribute to Dan. Bill pledged $100,000 to launch a million thanks to Dan Givelber. What does that represent? The Givelber Sovereign Public Interest Co-op Fund currently stood at the time at $500,000. And Bill astutely said, well, let's make it $1 million. So as of now, we are halfway there. We raised over $250,000, $250,000, and we are committed and are talking to donors to get us the rest of the way there. The Givelber Sovereign Public Interest Fund is an essential part of the social justice and public interest mission of our law school. It critically supports unfunded public interest co-ops. Thanks to Bill and our incredible donors who were inspired by Dan, we now have the ability to support even more students as they pursue the public interest work that is at the core of the law school's mission and was core to Dan's being. It's now my pleasure to introduce Bill Newman to say a few words as we end.
Thank you, Dean. This is an unusual thing for me. I'm a civil liberties lawyer. I'm not a personal injury lawyer. I did have one significant personal injury case for which the Givelber Subrin Public Interest Co-op Fund is a recipient. There are two teachers I had in my professional career who really mattered to me, Steve Subrin and Dan Givelber. And when I had a problem, a civil problem that was, I thought, really complicated, I called up Steve Subrin. Steve, starting the answer with, "That's a really interesting problem," not that helpful. When I had a serious ethical problem on my way to federal court in a criminal case, the person I called was Dan Givelber. And he also said, "That's a problem." But he also had really good advice. One was how not to do something adverse to your client, and also how not to be disbarred. On a more serious matter, I had a call one day from a friend, and the question was from a friend of his, George Kendall, in Georgia, saying, "Would you take a death penalty case?" And I followed that up for a while, and I got to the point where I was about to say yes or no to taking a death penalty case in Georgia. And the person I called was Dan Givelber. And he took the call, as he always did. And I said, "Should I do this?" And it was Dan. So there he started a sentence, and then in the middle of that sentence he started another sentence, and then there was another. But the amazing thing about Dan and his sentences is, although there would be three going on at one time, they would all eventually be completed, I mean, in some order. And that was the amazing part. And what Dan said, "Look, Bill, doing a death penalty case," and he was running the CERT clinic at the time, said doing a death penalty case is a lot like being the captain of a large commercial jetliner. Said there are interminable periods of immense boredom, interspersed by occasional moments of sheer terror. I said, "Was that a yes or a no?" And it was, in fact, a yes, but it was a very gentle yes, because he understood the burdens that would go with that. And it turned out, I'll just say parenthetically in a few seconds, to be one of the most amazing experiences in my life, where I worked with people like George Kendall and Brian Stevenson, and we won the case. Not only thank you. The thing about Dan, and the reason that I wanted to start this fund, there are two reasons. One is, and really about Dan. He cared about me, and he cared about all of us as prospective lawyers. He also cared about us as human beings, and those were related, and those were central to him, and they were central to how I experienced him. The other part of this is that I was lucky enough when I went to Northeastern that I could take a job with Texas Rural Legal Aid. And although it didn't pay much, I could do it. And I took a job with the public defenders in Alaska. And although it didn't pay a lot, I could do it. And I worked for Harvey Silverglade and Norm Zalkine in Boston, and for a civil rights attorney in Springfield. Those were formative experiences for me. And it seemed to me that it was wrong for privilege to decide whether or not you can have those kinds of amazing experiences when you're a student at Northeastern. And it shouldn't be the family you came from or the means that you have. We should all be in a situation where you and all the students can have the same opportunity for those amazing pro bono public interest experiences. And I thought that putting together two of the people who have been most central to me in my legal career and really meaningfully in my life, Steve Subrin and Dan Givelber, and doing something for the students of Northeastern University's law school and saying, this is the right thing to do, this is an important thing to do, and honoring Dan and Steve in this way is something we all should do. And I really hope that we will all meaningfully help out, because the real thought I had was, after I learned of Dan's passing, is we owe this man a million thanks.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks to everyone for attending tonight, all of the wonderful words. We still have food and beverage, so still time to commune and reflect upon Dan and then enjoy each other's company. Take care. Safe travels.